Okay, friends, let's bring it back in. So I have some good questions, or at least one good question here in Slack, as far as how the two different ways to declare a function. We're going to talk about that here in the next few minutes. So that's a really great question. Um, did anyone else have any thoughts? Did any light bulbs go off? Any other questions? Anything that maybe was reinforced by reading that article? Just anything of interest for you guys before we move forward?
The fact that I think this is what you meant was that you could the functions inside of a function can reference to a global function, but the function itself cannot see the values inside of this other function.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, we're going to talk about global scope today as well. But yeah, that idea that information and data in the global scope is pretty much accessible, as the name implies, it's accessible globally. But functions also have their own local scope, like a little black box. So you can see out of that black box, but you can't necessarily see in the black box. So we'll talk about that later this morning. That's a really good observation for sure. Yeah, so Mike actually uses a term called hoisting. That's a really great point. That's precisely what we're going to talk about this morning as far as the two different ways to declare functions for sure. Any other thoughts before we move into the lesson? Okay, cool. So I put the lesson objectives into Slack. Let's take a look at those really quickly. Again, just so you have kind of this information in your head, you're mindful of it as we go through the lesson today. So what we want to cover is describe how parameters and arguments relate to functions. Sometimes those two terms are interchangeable, which is fine, but we do want to delineate the difference between a parameter and an argument. There is a specific difference. We're going to create and call functions that accept parameters to solve a problem, define and call functions defined in terms of other functions, return a value from a function using the return keyword, define and call functions with argument-dependent return values, determine the scope of local and global variables, and then create a program that uses that fancy word hoists that Mike mentioned earlier. It's a very good term. So as we move forward, I want to ask a question of you guys, and you can put the questions or put your answers into Slack. But in your own words, how would you define or describe a function? What is it? Why would we want to take advantage of functions? Is there any advantage to using functions when we write our code? It's dry, that's right. What does dry stand for? Nice. Yeah, that's absolutely a huge reason to use functions for sure. Yeah, Christina mentions it's used to avoid repeating code. Absolutely. Keeping with that idea of dry, not repeating ourselves. Alan says a block of code that is set to a name that allows code to make more sense and avoid repetition. Yeah, so it's a way to modularize our code, maybe encapsulate it. Yeah, a good rule of thumb with functions is that you want a function to do one thing. Really well-written, object-oriented design, when you're creating objects, when you're creating functions. If you find that your function is doing more than one thing, you probably want, that's a good rule of thumb, that you want to simplify the function or maybe split it out into separate functions. So generally we want an object or a function to kind of manage one task or do one thing. Deb says organization. Yeah, absolutely. Alejandra, we can make our own methods and reuse them. Yeah, reusability, that's huge for sure. Easier to test. That's an excellent point. I wish we had more time to go over testing in this class. Testing is super important and super valuable. And absolutely, the more modularized you make your code, as you break it down into smaller pieces using functions, objects, and such, it does make it easier to test and maintain, for sure. Cool. Well, thanks for those answers. Here is kind of the quick and dirty from the lesson plan as far as, what is a function? So a function is a reusable statement or a group of reusable statements that can be called anywhere in the program. This avoids the need to rewrite the same statement over and over, so we don't repeat ourselves. We can keep our code very dry. Functions enable the software developer to segment large, unwieldy applications into smaller, more manageable pieces. So you guys pretty much hit the nail on the head with that one. A critical component of programming, functions address a key tenet of engineering: don't repeat yourself or try to be dry. The goal is to create programs with as little code as possible while maintaining complete clarity. Another important trait of functions is that they are similar to objects or strings. Functions can be passed into other functions as an argument, and when we talk about that ability of functions, it's referred to as a higher order function. So it's just kind of just what they're referred as. A higher order function is a function that can be passed into other functions, just like a string or a number, any other kind of argument or parameter. They can also be used like any other object that we've been working with, essentially. Yeah, go ahead. Someone came on mic.
That was the function passed into the other one is the higher order. The function receiving the other one is a higher order.
Well, it's kind of both. Higher order functions just it's more of like a kind of an umbrella blanket term, but a higher order function is a function that can be passed into other functions. So either a function that receives a function or the function that actually gets passed in, that ability is referred to as a higher order operation or a higher order function. It's kind of more of a blanket term than like the specific receiving or the one that's being inserted. Cool. Let's talk about, we're actually going to address Alan's question right now. Let's talk a little bit about function declaration. So there are two ways that we declare functions, and we want to touch on both of these. We're going to use one method mainly throughout class, and we'll talk a little bit about why we're doing that. But we want you to be mindful and aware that there are two ways to declare a function. As you read blog articles or go to GitHub and check out code, you're going to see both ways. So just so you're aware that it's kind of the same thing, there's some slight differences, but you'll see both ways of function declaration out there. So before we call or use a function, we must define it or declare it. So in JavaScript, functions can be defined in several ways. Two common methods are function declarations and function expressions. So I'm going to share my screen, and if you guys want to follow along, you're welcome to. I'm going to be playing around in Replit for a little bit, just for our demo purposes today. So let me go ahead and start my screen share. And we'll talk about these two methods, maybe some advantages or disadvantages to using them. Cool. Okay. So can you guys all see my Replit, my screen and such? Okay, cool. So let's talk about this first one. So a function declaration. So this is what it looks like. If you guys want to type along just for demo purposes, feel free. So a declaration would be using the function keyword first to declare it or define it. So if we were going to create a function speak, and maybe we pass in as a parameter, we're going to pass in some words. And then we're going to console log words. Pretty simple function. But when we use that, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, are you able to make that any bigger?
Yeah, sure. Oh, show. I'll make all this a little bit bigger. How's that? Is that helpful?
Oh yeah. And guys, if it's too small, just remind us.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So this is referred to as a function declaration. We use that function keyword first, and then we need to name the function. So in this case, we're going to name this function speak, and then we can define any parameters that we want to pass in. In this case, we're going to pass in a parameter of words, and then we're going to console log words. So pretty simple function declaration. If we wanted to define this function using a function expression, it would look just slightly different. So we would actually assign the function to a variable. And it would look like something like this. So these two are going to accomplish the same thing, and we would actually call them the same way. So if I were, let me load this up into my REPL. So actually, that's probably going to blow up on me since we have it defined twice. Let me comment that one out. So if we run this, I could do speak, and then hello WDI. And if I uncomment our expression, let me run that again. So either way, we're going to get the same result. Now, there's a very important distinction between using both of these methods to define a function. And it has to do with hoisting, which is what Mike alluded to in Slack. So let's take a look at that next. So I'll paste this into Slack. Let me shrink it down. Essentially, hoisting has to do with the order in which code is read and loaded into memory to run your program. So while both of those speak methods, we're defining two functions called speak, while they share some similarities, only function declarations define functions that can be used anywhere in the scope where they're defined using this thing called hoisting. So in other words, you can call a function that is defined using a function declaration before the part of the code where you actually define it. So you can actually invoke or use that function before you define it in your code. And that's really the great advantage of using a function declaration versus an expression. So let's see what we mean by that. So I'm going to go back to this example, and we'll start with the declaration first. So up here on the very first line, let me go ahead and invoke this function, and I'll just put hello WDI right here. I'll clear that, and then if I run it, so when I run this code, note that I'm invoking or trying to call the function before I even define it here on line 3. This is I'm able to do this because I'm using a function declaration here. So essentially what's happening is JavaScript is going to read the code, load any variables, any functions into memory, and then it'll go back and recognize when you try to invoke or call those functions. So here, even though I call the function before it even gets loaded into memory, before I even define it, JavaScript's going to read the code once, load everything into memory, and then it knows about this function when I call it on line 1. And this is the benefit of using a function declaration like this. So let's see what happens if we use a function expression instead of a declaration. Let's run the same line of code. We saw a moment ago that this is essentially the same function, right? It's just going to console log whatever we pass into it. But let's see what happens if we try to use a expression versus a declaration. So if we run it, we get a type error. Speak is not a function. So what's happening here is that since we're using an expression and the function is defined after we actually call it, in this case, JavaScript is not going to know about this function when it runs it up here. So this has to do with hoisting. It has to do with kind of the order that we write our code. And this is really the biggest difference between declarations and expressions in JavaScript. Now, we internally as an instructional team and throughout the course, we try to have kind of a style guide, kind of a rule of thumb. So for all of our lessons and all of our labs and homeworks, we try to maintain some consistency in how we show you guys stuff. Because I know that this is hard enough to learn as it is, not to mention if you're seeing things, in different ways and such. So throughout this class, what we're going to encourage you guys to use and what we're going to try to consistently use in all of our presentations and stuff, we're going to be using function expressions. So we're going to be defining functions like this. So let me ask you guys, why would we want, as far as this class goes, why would we prefer and suggest that you guys use this type of function declaration, this type of function definition versus this up here? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? It's not really a super trick question. It's just kind of the way that we present stuff. Maybe other languages don't use hoisting. That's a good point, yeah. So Ruby, for example, doesn't have hoisting. Ruby is very procedural. So it reads like a book, right? Or a story. So in Ruby, you have to have things in order. Otherwise, it's going to break. Ruby doesn't have hoisting, for example. Yeah, great. So Christina says to get in the habit of declaring variables. That's good. Easy way to keep things organized. That's excellent. Define it when you need it. Yeah, all of those are really excellent. Maybe other don't have access to the function definition. Yeah, that's a good point as well. I would say, so the reason that we suggest that we use function expressions is because we want you to kind of be mindful and be very deliberate about how you write your code. So particularly for newer programmers, we want you to think about the order of your code. And so using these function expressions forces you to think about the order of your code, and you can't necessarily write a function after you try to call it. So throughout this course, we're going to try to adhere to using the expressions. As we get into later units and such, I mean, you can be a little bit flexible, but this forces you to write a function before you actually use it. So we just kind of lean toward this way of defining functions. So that is function declarations versus a function expression. Do you guys have any questions on those two ways to define a function? Again, either is valid. Just through the course, we're going to, most of the time lean toward function expressions.
One thing comes to mind, I mean, most of my experience is with compiled languages. So on the second one as the expression, if I wanted to call that again, var speak 2, I have to basically define the function again. I can't just call it.
Sorry, could you, I'm sorry, maybe I'm not understanding the question.
If I want to use that function again,
okay.
The second one,
The var speak equals function?
Right.
Okay.
Then I have to write it 2 times in my code. Whereas the first one, it's written once.
Why would you have to write it twice?
Because the way I'm looking.
I think I know what you mean. I think that's like more like with like C and C++, where you define like the function before at the top, and then you can use them in the body. I'm not too like versed in that, but I think that's what you mean. I think it's the same question. I was thinking it makes sense.
Well, I'm not quite sure. I've dabbled in C, but I can't speak to how C operates in the compiled language.
So let's say that, like you just wrote speak. So what if I have speak 2?
Like something like speak 2, like this?
Well, let's see. How would you?
Or like something like that.
Right. So let's say that's your example. So here you've executed the function speak 2 times with two different arguments. But the function speak was only written once. Find someone.
Yeah.
So
Well, you
get. But then the second instance, where you use it as you call it as a variable, or the output of the function goes into speak. Is that?
Well, let's try it out. So let me just remove this. I'll console log that out. So let me clear this. Let me load this file into memory. So I've loaded this function, this var speak. So I can go over here and do speak hello world. I can do that. I can do speak hello Mark. So once it's loaded into memory, we only defined it once, but we can reuse it.
Oh, Okay.
Yeah.
But what if you want to do var speak to equals, and then you have to do function words console log again? You wanted to put the output in another variable.
I'm sorry, Deb. I'm just not under. Would you mind putting some code into Slack and we can take a look? If I'm understanding you correctly, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. How you can get return values from one function and pass it into another function, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'd have to see a specific example. But just the rule of thumb, if you're going to use a function expression, the order matters. So just be mindful of that. So if I was going to use the output of var speak in another function, I would probably want, again, if I'm understanding you correctly, so I would still probably want to define the function that I want to use second. I would still want to define it underneath where I want to get the output. So if I was going to get like output of speak, I would still need to define speak before I tried to use the output value as a general rule. Var speak 2 equals speak hello world. Oh, okay, I think I see. So yeah, we could do, so that's actually not, okay, let me see what, we'll just run it. If I can spell correctly. And then if we do undefined, let me see if I can run it over here. We're going to talk a little bit about, I think if we, where did I misspell something? Speak. Yeah, let me try this one more time and we'll move forward. We're going to talk a little bit about using a reserved keyword called return. And so maybe that'll help clear some of this up. But yeah, let's just try it one more time if I'm understanding you correctly. So we loaded the file into memory. And then if we did like speak mark, so it console logs the string that we pass in. And then you're suggesting if we did var speak 2, and if we made that like world, and then if we call speak 2 as undefined. You know, I think what's happening here, let me see if I can do that.
So the reason why it's returning undefined is because, like you said, Mark, we're not returning anything.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's kind of nothing. There's nothing in that function.
Yeah. Let's move forward because we're going to talk about return here in a minute. So we're going to do, you know, you could probably do something like that, return words, and then speak 2 would have that words value. But yeah, let's come back to that. If the question doesn't get answered, Deb, just you know, pop up in a few minutes for sure. Yeah, so Mike says, sounds like she wants to save the value returned by the function. Yeah, absolutely. I think when we get to the return keywords, if you're trying to access, it's considered a pure function. So a pure function is when we're not changing behavior, we're just trying to get a value from a function. I think the return keyword will help us out there, and we're going to get to that a little bit later. Cool. Let's move forwards. Any other questions about declarations versus expressions? Just two different ways to define a function, but I just wanted you guys to be mindful that with expressions, the order does matter in your code. Cool. Let me put this into Slack. So 3 things that function, when we define a function, 3 things that it must have. You must name the function, it has a name. It has an optional list of parameters. So if you want to invoke or call a function and pass in arguments, then we need to define the function with parameters initially. And then the statements inside the function. So in this example, once we define the function speak, what do we want to happen when we invoke that function? And right here we had, you know, like console log words. So that would be considered, you know, the behavior of the function, the statement. What do we want this function to do for us? Do we want it to change some behavior somewhere? Do we want it just to like add 2 numbers and return the sum or something? So those are the 3 components of functions. Calling functions, I think I mentioned this a little bit on Tuesday. But there's a difference between recalling a function and actually invoking a function. And so for this example, the replet isn't super great at this. So I think I'm going to go into the JavaScript console and the dev tools. But let me run it really quick and see if this will do what we want. So for example, I just loaded this. Let me clear that out. So I loaded this speak function into memory, and so now I can do, as we saw earlier, I could do like speak mark. And so that function is loaded into memory. Now, if I just do speak without the parentheses, that returns, well, in replet, it returns the data type. So this is a function, it's an object, and that function is called speak. If I want to actually invoke or call the function, I would need to add the parentheses to it like you see here. But what I wanted to show you guys really quickly, the replet's a little vague, but the cool thing about the JavaScript console, if you guys want to do Command Option J, that's a shortcut to get down in here into the console area. And remember, this should have been in your fundamentals, but the console in your Chrome browser or in Safari or what have you, JavaScript is the language of the web, right? And so we don't need any kind of compiler to understand it because all browsers understand JavaScript, you know, kind of out of the box, which is really cool. But I just wanted to show you what that would look like here. So let me declare that function one more time. I'll do this hello function that's in the lesson. And if you guys want to follow along, feel free. So just let me do a simple hello. And when you're in the console, if you want to go to like the next line, you can hold down the shift and hit enter, and it'll go to the next line. It won't run the code, it'll just give you like a new line. And then I'll console log hello there, for example. And we'll close that out like so. So I have that loaded into memory. So now if I just call hello, but I don't put the parentheses, the cool thing about the JavaScript console, what I wanted to show you guys, is it actually, you know, literally returns the innards or the content of that function, which is kind of cool. Replet doesn't really do that for some reason, but when we're running Node in the terminal and such, if you're running a program, for example, using the Node server, it will do this as well. It'll actually show you the content of the function. So here, when I type in hello, I'm essentially asking what is the content, what are the contents of that function, you know, named hello. But to invoke it, I would just need to make sure to put in the parentheses, like so. And then we get the result. Oh, actually, I didn't even pass in a parameter, so I didn't even need to do that there. But this is a pretty, I just mentioned this because this is a pretty typical misunderstanding sometimes. Sometimes in your projects or in your homework or something, you'll be like, well, I defined the function and I'm calling it, but it's not returning anything. You know, I'm getting errors or undefined or something. And a lot of the time, it's just because you forget the parentheses. So again, just want to kind of be very specific and point that out. So if you ever have some sort of issue, a good thing to check first and foremost is to make sure that you're actually invoking the function with parentheses. Any questions about invoking versus just, you know, returning the contents of a function definition? Cool. Okay, so let's move forward. We'll take a break in like maybe 15 minutes, take a quick 5 or maybe about 12:30, so thanks for hanging in there. Actually, I have a you-do coming up next too, so that'll be good. So JavaScript functions are often defined as methods on an object. So when we define a function inside of an object, the technical term is referred to as a method. And well, let's look at this first, and then I wanted to show you something else in the console. Any Riri fans out there? Rihanna? Anybody? That's my jam. But if you guys want to follow along, let's create this that I put into Slack. I'm going to type out, let's create this person object, and we'll see what it looks like to define a function inside an object, which we refer to as a method. So I'll just put a name, Rihanna, And then let's define a speak function in this person object. And this is going to be an anonymous function. And in here, nothing too crazy. We'll just have a console log work, 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 work. I think that's enough works. Work, work, work. Okay, yeah, I think it's 5. Cool, and then we'll put a semicolon there. So if we run this, we load up that person into memory. And so now when I call the person variable, I see that that object has a name, property, and it also has a method called speak. So again, speak, it's a function, but the technical term when you add a function inside of an object, it's generally referred to as a method at that point, but it's still pretty much the same thing. It's just technically how you would refer to it. But now that we have this object, which we're gonna, I think Maddie B is gonna talk more about objects tomorrow morning, but we can use dot notation to access the properties and methods on this person object. So for example, if I wanted to grab the name of the person, will someone put into Slack how I could grab the name of this person object? What would that look like? Cool, yeah. We can just use dot notation here, so we can do person.name, and that'll return Rihanna. And then if we wanted to, let's say that we wanted to invoke the speak method in person, what would that look like? And you can put that into Slack as well. Shouldn't be too super tricky. Scoot this over a little bit. Yeah, for sure, just person.speak. And again, if I don't put the parentheses, it's just gonna tell me, hey, this is a function and it's called speak, but it's not gonna do anything. Remember that we still need those parentheses to actually invoke it. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this in the future, but this is a really great pattern and a really great way to create this object-oriented design and adding methods to an object and calling it that way. It has to do with namespacing. So if you guys have some free time and you want to look up namespacing, it's kind of more of an intermediate kind of thought, but it's a really good pattern if you have a very complex code base. Creating objects out of your properties and your functions and creating methods out of them is a really nice way to organize your code. One instance of this, and let me go into the console to show you guys this, is you've already been using this type of object-oriented design with methods. For example, the math object in JavaScript, capital M math, that's just a fancy object that has a bunch of methods attached to it. So somewhere deep inside the JavaScript source code, there's a capital M math object, and inside that object it has .sum or .floor, .random. And the cool thing about the console, we're going to talk a little bit more about DevTools on Monday, but if you guys go to the JavaScript console and type in capital M math, the really cool thing I think about this, just put a dot after math. And the JavaScript console is automatically going to show you all of the available methods that you can call on that math object. So if I don't want to go to the documentation, I could just quickly scroll through here. What am I looking for? Oh, maybe I want to do an exponent, exponential type calculation, or maybe you want to find the max or the min of something. But these are all the available methods that you have available to you on that math object. And if you went to the source code underneath the hood, I'll just kind of pseudocode it real quick, but I bet that it looks something like this. It would be var math, and then you'd probably have like, sum, and then, add stuff, and then you would have, I don't know, max, which is a function, and then, find the max of stuff. I think you get the idea. But math is just a big fancy object. And so that's why when we call sum or floor or random, we do it like so. you know, that kind of thing. So math's just a big fancy object underneath the hood. I find that pretty interesting. Maybe you guys do too. Any questions about adding functions to an object like we did here with person? So again, technically speaking, if we're creating an object and if we define a function inside of that object, what do we refer to that as? What would we call it? Would we still call it a function, or would we call it something else? Cool. Yeah, method. And by the way, we've talked about this. We've talked this week. So even clear that out. So even when we array methods, string methods, similar to math, underneath the hood, if I create like a mark string, underneath the hood, and this is just kind of pseudocoding, but even string is a big fancy constructor, right? Sting. Leaves of gold and such, huh? So even string has like, maybe a concat method on that object. What are some other string methods you guys can think of? Maybe like a to uppercase, right? So string is just a fancy object that we can create new instances of. And so that's why, we can call the to uppercase method on a string, or a concat on a string, or a char at, character at, that kind of thing. So pretty cool stuff, object-oriented programming, which we're going to get a lot of practice with that, not only in JavaScript, but in Ruby, which is, well, they're both pure object-oriented programming languages, but I think Ruby is a little bit more well-known for that. I think it's a little bit easier to create objects and to add new methods and properties to an object in Ruby versus JavaScript. Cool, so that brings us to a little bit of an activity time. Let's get a little bit of practice with what we've done so far. So what I want you guys to do, let's just take a few minutes and we'll do a couple of these exercises. So I want you guys to take a few minutes, write a function that logs I come from out of a function to the console, and then invoke that function. And then give me a thumbs up in Slack when you're done. Feel free to do this in Replit, and I'll Slack this out just in case you have any questions about it. But yeah, see if you can write a function that logs I come from out of a function to the console, and then invoke that function, and then give me a thumbs up when you are complete. And I'll stop my screen share for now. Cool. Got a couple of thumbs ups, which is awesome. Let me ask someone. Alejandra, would you mind sharing your screen briefly and walking us through your function, showing us what you did? I'll go ahead and unmute you. There you
Thank you. I was trying
go. The floor is yours.
Okay, I declare the function using the expression. I called it a function.
Good.
I guess this is just the standard way to set it up. And inside the function, there's only one thing that it will do. It'll print out, I come out of the function, and then I call the function by writing it outside of the function with the, whatever these are called, and the semicolon. So you can see the result of this.
Yeah, very nice. By the way, so if you look into Slack, thanks for sharing, Alejandra. Just while you're sharing your screen, just kind of an interesting thing. So you created a function using a function expression. If you look in Slack, Kieran, for example, used a function declaration, yes? But I think this is interesting. If you go back to your replit, Alejandra, so on line 4, get rid of that semicolon on line 4. Now see how you, Replit's pretty cool about debugging and kind of linting your stuff. It lets you know, hey, you're missing a semicolon or you're missing a closing curly brace or something. So note that when you use a function expression that you have to add a semicolon to the end of it. And that's why it's, barking at you there. So correct. Yes, I was going to ask you, can you refactor this into a definition? Just for grins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't worry about running it. Just build it. And...
Was it new?
No. So yeah, a little bit simpler than that. Even we don't need to use the new. Close. Does someone want to help out Alejandra? Maybe put it into Slack.
Or it was function.
Nice. Yeah.
Function.
Yeah. Yeah. And so notice, just another like very small kind of quirk. When you use a function declaration, you don't need a semicolon at the end of it because it's more of a statement. Function statements do not need semicolons at the end of them. Function expressions do need a semicolon. So if something's going to return a value, so you see on line 5, for example, when she actually invokes a function, that's going to return a value. And so JavaScript needs a semicolon at the end of it. It's going to run fine if you don't do it, but it's just kind of a, if you're dotting your T's and crossing your I's and such, we put semicolons at the end of JavaScript statements, which is kind of like a sentence, like an English sentence, and JavaScript expressions, or something that returns a value, does not need a semicolon. So just a really small thing. If it's barking at you because it needs a semicolon, that would be why. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Let me put another quick activity into Slack. And give me a thumbs up when you finish this one. So write a function that logs the sum of 2 plus 2, and then invoke that function, and then give me a thumbs up when you're done.
When you mean it invokes the sum of 2 plus 2, like, what do you mean by that?
Just call it, just like you did in your...
But like, what do you want it to show? The string 2 plus 2 or the solution of 2 plus 2?
The solution. Yeah. The sum of 2 plus 2. Yeah, don't worry about creating a function that has parameters. We're going to talk about that next. Just a sum function that will return 2 plus 2. Cool. So Christina popped hers into Slack. Christina, do you want to come on? Do you mind sharing your screen and just kind of talking through your code there? Yeah.
Is that working?
Yeah, looks good.
All I did was just do the variable. I just named it sum and then function, and then obviously remove the parentheses because it's not a string and it's just doing 2 plus 2.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And so when you ran that in Replit, it returned 4.
Yes.
Okay, nice. So I'll give this to the class while you're still sharing your screen. Does anyone see how we could, are we missing anything from Christina's function that you guys can see? Replit's helping us out. It's kind of barking at us. Yeah, so it looks like we need to add 2 semicolons. And again, Replit's pretty handy as far as giving us those little like eyes, kind of information prompts. Yeah, and where would we put the other one? Yeah, very nice, cool. So Christina, how did you define this function? Did you use a declaration or a function expression?
This one is the expression, right?
Yeah, nice. So if you try to invoke the function on line 1, so if you moved sum up to line 1, if you move like line 5, if you move that up to the very, very top.
Oh, this part right here.
Yeah, so if you move that to the top, and yeah, just get rid of that space. So is this going to work before you even run it?
No.
Why won't this work?
Because the variable hasn't been named first. It's out of order.
Yeah, so it has to do with hoisting. So remember, function declarations, we can invoke the function before we actually define it. But when we create a function using an expression, the order matters. So yeah, so we can't call it before we use a function expression to define it in this example. Cool, very, very nice. Cool, let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back and move forward. We'll talk about function parameters. So great work. We'll see you guys at 12:35.